Okay, hey guys, you know how I'm going to start this video off. I want to make sure that our audio, Mike, go ahead and say hi real quick. Make sure our
Hi,
audio,
everybody.
we're going to make sure our audio here is really good for everybody. This is my first time writing solo on StreamYard. Martin Leakey has done a great job coaching me and showing me how to use this system. I had never used it. We were using OBS. Audio is good. Thank you, Itis Flat. That'll work. That'll work. As you guys can see, I'm in the smaller studio today. This is where it all started. I'm never going to abandon it. Got this studio here is designed for like book reviews. Every single book you see behind me and all the ones stacked up on the floor and all around me, these are future videos. These are some profound books, and I just need time to go into them. But my special guest today is STELLIUM7. He's been reaching out to me for a while, but circumstances prevailing, I have been so busy going in multiple different directions. I'm still trying to catch up with my podcast list, and he's got some really interesting material. And for many of you already know, the crossover, it concerns vapor canopy period, and to find the things that he has found, the biological material, fossilized, petrified materials that look like rock formations and essentially are today, could only have been possible in a vapor canopy environment. So, Mike, why don't you, for those of my listeners who are new to you, you've been on YouTube about as long as I have. I think you may have started a little bit later, but why don't you introduce yourself and your background, who you are, and how you came to do this type of research? Because we understand that this is just a conversation, but for people to see your research, it'll blow their minds. It's almost all visual. They'll have to go to your channel and see the pictures, see the science, the charts, and have you explain them to really fully grasp what it is you're talking about. But why don't you give us a general introduction?
Okay, well, like you said, I started my YouTube channel about 4 years ago, and that followed a whole bunch of different things that kind of came my way as far as information. I'd been looking into all kinds of things with, alternative history and Earth shape and, just the nature of our reality, looking into, revisionistic history and understanding that maybe not everything that I learned in college was actually accurate. And I went to school in the US. I got a bachelor's degree in Italian cultural studies, started as a philosophy major, and then switched when I went to Italy. And then later I went back to school and I studied to become a chiropractor. And that was a 5-year education. So I've spent a lot of my time in traditional education and really have learned so much more in the last 5, 6 years, 7 years since really waking up to a lot of the false narratives that are out there, probably than I have in my entire life. So it's been a real journey, and I have, I've come about this from a kind of a backwards way, because I was exposed to different ideas, like you mentioned, the petrification, megaflora, megafauna. I first saw some videos by Mud Fossil University, which many have heard of. There's another channel at the same time called Flat Earth Nation. He's now known as Mud Flood Was Armageddon. And
a lot of people here know Roger.
Yeah. He's got a very tried and true following, and he's been around for a long time. And then it was really a video by J Dreamers that kind of put pieces of the puzzle together and caused me to start really looking at the world around me, the rocks around me, differently. And it started initially with a mountain here in Spain that's in the town that I live in. And it has a great resemblance to an elephant. And it has a cave that's right in the right location for you've got the skull shape. The cave is right where it should be. There's a discoloration right where you would have had an ear attachment. I later found out that there was a cave there as well that goes in deep, that had been explored by a whole team of archaeologists that went in and they did 3D mapping, and it was a pretty deep rabbit hole. But initially, I was just interested in the whole concept of mud fossils, this idea that things could petrify a lot quicker than we ever imagined they could. And the mainstream geological narrative, which I never studied in school more than just like high school, and seeing lots of articles in passing through the normal media outlets, but I understood the basics of petrogenesis and how things are supposed to have come about. When it comes to, you got your igneous and your metamorphic and your sedimentary rocks, and that's all basically coming about through wildlife that's died and compressed either under the seafloor or just on Earth over long periods of time, and then that's leading to a compression that's eventually melting that sedimentary rock and creating this blurring, blending, swirling kind of rock that we call metamorphic rock. And I just took it for granted that was how it happened, and that tectonic activity happened the way they told us, and volcanoes worked the way they told us, and all these things. And so, in the course of watching some of Roger's videos and seeing his, every third video he does is on the dragon in the Sahara, this 1,000-mile long behemoth that he likes to go into a lot of detail with. And I thought, okay, that's pretty far-fetched, and it was hard for me to buy that something like that could be real, especially on a 24,901 mile spinning ball. It didn't make any sense to me. The thing would take a few strides and it would be back where it started, So, but I had also been looking a lot into Earth shape for a couple of years at that point. So it wasn't such a stretch for me, realizing that a lot of what we've been told about the heliocentric model is fabrication, and NASA's full of bull, and SpaceX too. So, so when I started to ponder these things, it wasn't so far-fetched, really. And that's kind of how it began.
Okay, I mean, that's pretty good. Roger is an anomaly to me, and it's, I have to take him seriously. He has commented on my channel. He's definitely a recluse. I engaged him in the comment section. I dignified him with a response. He doesn't leave his comments up on other channels. He'll leave them up until he's acknowledged, and then he takes his comments back down, which is fine. And he's an anomaly to me because I still can't process, and I'll be the first to admit, I still can't process a dragon the size of the Sahara Desert. And I just can't process it. Or even on a flat Earth model, the luminary that we call the sun doesn't light a whole huge area, and this is why the extremities have this half-life. This is why there's only 6 months out of the year they have any light. So I understand that a lot of people buy into the flat plane that's indefinite. And this would require other luminaries. The sun couldn't be the only one because it's very, very local. Being a local object, it can only brighten a certain area. I'm on board with the flat plane, but I don't know how far it extends. I know there's a lot of theoretical material about additional continents and all that. And if that's true, then creatures could have been that size, and we could be microscopic today compared to the life forms of yesterday. But as far as there being biological materials preserved in petrification, I'm on board with that. I'm on board with it because the vapor canopy world would have been very anomalous. In addition to that, I only deal with the historical record. ARCHAIX only goes back to 5239 BC, and I don't entertain anything beyond that because it's the most ancient calendar that we have. It goes back at 600-year periods, and then all the other calendars attached to that. Now, I'm not saying that that's all of history. I'm saying that that's recorded history. We have nothing beyond that date that we can find from date stelae, architecture, monuments, anything written in the cuneiform, anything in the Sumerian logograms. We have nothing that goes beyond that date. So I'm not saying that the vapor canopy that I have uncovered that happened during the historical record was the only one. And that's why this is all fascinating to me, because the vapor canopy could have been a world way before the antediluvian world, way before the Genesis pre-flood world that I have documented, a mere 1,656 year period where humans grew to huge sizes. The megafauna, gigantic reptiles and amphibians and insects, and that world would have been very different than the world we're in today. But even that model doesn't comport with a world with life forms the size of mountains. So this would require a more ancient vapor canopy world that was even thicker, a thicker mesosphere with even more volcanism, because those are the only things that are really required to create that increased atmospheric pressure, increased oxygen. Because you know, Mike, that the larger the creature, the more oxygen they're going to have. So this the fossil record is very, very clear. Our world was like a Garden of Eden. There was no need for the agrarian sciences. There was no agriculture. Humans literally lived off the land. They didn't really have need for clothing. It was a beautiful tropical paradise. Unfortunately, the ambient radiation and the vapor canopy ultraviolet light that came in, which is the same that we use to increase the size in hydroponics and in our greenhouses for plants, this type of world, everything grew huge. So I can imagine that even further back in the past, there would have been another vapor canopy prior to the introduction of humans into this part of the construct. And in that world, yes, you could have had biological organisms the size of mountains. I have no doubt.
Yeah, I mean, even in the mainstream geological narrative, they're talking about megaflora and megafauna and 70 centimeter long dragonflies and, massive beasts. And, you were talking about greater concentrations of oxygen. And that's also something that they discuss. And in fact, there's, modern scientific experiments where they've gone into rooms and created pressure with increased oxygen and gotten incredible results just growing plants in that kind of environment. So things were definitely bigger in the past. And when you talk about a previous era, that could accommodate creatures of that size, I'm totally on board with what you said about that as well, because I think that our existence, this reality that we're in, has a fractal quality to it, and or holographic, whatever you want to see it as. The part contains the whole, but it also is scalable. And so when I first started pondering this thing with the elephant, the mountain here in Spain, it was because of what I'd seen with Roger. And I just thought, okay, well, if this is true, then that makes sense from a fractal, perspective, that because this mountain is roughly 3 miles long. So, a fractal jump up from that, 1,000 miles, compare a 3 mile elephant to a giant mammoth. You've got a fractal level down from that. And then we have smaller elephants. We have, so I don't really see a problem with it. And as far as Earth shape goes and how big the plane is, whether it's, an infinite plane, I lean more towards we're in some kind of an enclosure, and that it's, I often talk about the toroid, because it's a shape, it's a thing that repeats itself all throughout nature. A lot of my videos, I've touched on this, looking also at the heart and the function and the nature of the heart, and what we've learned in the last few decades about how blood flows through the heart. It's not pushed through the heart. It's actually this dual spiraling vortexual flow that happens. So I see this toroid. It's in magnetics, it's in plasma physics, it's in sound, it's in everything. So
Right.
I don't see any reason why our realm couldn't be a toroid that's oscillating, that's changing and expanding and contracting, and and has some sort of a singularity at a central point, which would explain the North Pole. It would explain our aurora borealis and all this stuff that's happening there towards what appears to be the center of the AE map, if you're thinking in that way. So yeah, all of that makes sense to me.
So educate me. What do you mean by AE map?
Oh, azimuthal equidistant. That would be like that would be the sorry, yeah, that would be the
I have a poster
like the Gleason's map.
Right.
That's that, and that's obviously loaded with controversy. And there's they
Well,
you could call it the map wars.
Here it is right here. This is Gleason's work from 1890, right here. Yeah,
right. I don't have that one.
This has got all the equidistant azimuthal maps. It's got amazing scientific documentation, everything that they were doing back then to prove that our world is not moving at all. And it's a book before its time. But actually, it was Eric Dubé who put me on to Gleason and zetetic astronomy. And
well, it's interesting because when I was younger, I did a lot of reading on comparative mythology. I was I read several books by Joseph Campbell, and I was always interested in syncretism, though I didn't know what syncretism was at the time. It was just this cross-cultural overlap of mythology and religion, and I always felt like, okay, the whole world is warring over religion and different ideas, and probably the truth lies where the overlaps are. And so when I was reading, Campbell's stuff years and years ago, it just resonated with me and made a lot of sense. And a lot of the things that I was reading back then they were really kind of watered down versions of deeper texts that you talk about regularly on your channel that had basically been packaged for the layman and were sold in the New Age bookstores and that sort of thing. So a lot of what I was getting was third, fourth, fifth hand sources. So I didn't really go back like you have to the primaries. And I thought it was fascinating when I first came across your channel, how you were, because essentially it seems like what you were trying to do is chunk all of world's history and all of the mythology and make sense of all of this. And so how do you do that? You do that through chronology. And I never really thought about that, but it makes sense because you've got all these different calendars and different timelines. But the events are going to be, if they're worldwide events, they're going to be happening all over the realm at similar times. And so even if you've got different languages and you got different calendars and this is when the world began, no, it began here, and et cetera, et cetera.
It is, hey, Mike, I have to address what you're saying. Listen, people don't realize how compartmentalized academia is. They have no idea that the anthropologists don't even refer to the journals of the geologists. Geologists spend their entire career only going through the materials that are peer-reviewed by other geologists, and they don't even know what botanists are finding. The botanists themselves don't know anything about anthropology. They don't know anything about astronomy. No one is checking and cross-referencing into other fields. In fact, the multidisciplinary approach is actually frowned upon. They keep it so compartmentalized, and all it does is abstract knowledge. No one really knows anything. So when I found that the historians were doing the exact same thing, and what I mean is that a Sumerologist and a Syriologist would basically understand and know a lot of the same things up until a certain point, but then there would be places where there was crossover with ancient Egyptian king lists and dynastic lists, and they would never reference that an area of Sumer, Akkad, and Elam would be totally devastated, and there would be a reset for like a century with no development, no regnal lists, no histories. Archaeologists comport that new layers of clay and mud and sand are deposited upon old foundations, and they built on top of them. And every bit of this would be there just and be totally ignored by the Egyptologists who call it the first intermediate period, which is a very clever way of saying that something happened in Egypt, but we have no history, no records. We don't know what's going on. Nothing was left. It was total destruction, and it took about a century for the country to wake up. They'll call that the first intermediate period. Then it happens again 5 centuries later, and it's called the second intermediate period. But all the annals and records and myths and traditions that are datable all around the world know that second intermediate period was a 300-year period where the world tried to rebound after a total systemic collapse. And many civilizations call it by different names. Some of them it was the day the sky fell. Others, it was the return of the phoenix. It was the return of the sky dragon. Others called it the Great Flood. Some called it some referred to it as the collapse of the dark midnight and the birth of the sun calendars. And so this interdisciplinary approach is what I have brought to the table. But I brought it to the table from a totally unique basically perspective, because there are no universities, there's nothing in academia today that promotes chronology. It is the most ignored of all studies, and yet we have thousands of records containing hundreds of thousands of chronographic markers. A chronographic marker is simply a reference in a text that gives you something that you can date and compare it to something else. So this interdisciplinary approach is the reason why we're in the pickle that we're in today, that we're having to put all these pieces together, because the people who consider themselves to be the intellectually elite are actually the most blind to the evidence that's out there.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, peer review is by definition a logical fallacy, because it's an appeal to authority. And, the whole system in my mind is designed to funnel the power into the hands of the few when it comes to, control of narratives. And, working in the healthcare system, I've seen that not just over the last few years, very poignantly illustrated, but for decades. And
there's no doubt.
it goes back to the 20s, the complete takeover of what we call medicine, of the robber barons, essentially. It's just so obvious. And then you have all of these different societies that are, in control of the narratives. And it's, like you said, it's fully compartmentalized I'm thinking of Scaligean chronology as an example in history. I'm not a history buff by any means, and I can't, do what you do, with all these dates and dynasties and whatnot. But I saw an interesting 6-part series by Jacob Duhlman and Jan Irvin from Logos Media, where they were looking deeply into the primary sources when it came to Scaligean chronology, which is the chronology that we all essentially in the Western world live under, as I understand it. And it's all a crock of bull. And the guy was a total fraud, and all of his contemporaries at the time said so. And, there's so many problems with that. And yet almost our entire history that we've been fed goes back to this one man who was a total charlatan. So I can recommend that to people to go through it. The chronology and chunking all of this data, it makes sense to have done it the way you did it. And you obviously, with your life being what it's been, had the time to sit down and compare all this stuff and draw these timelines up. So I commend you for the work you've done. I think it's pretty huge. Actually, it's kind of hard to even wrap your head around. But
hey, listen, I got an army of veterans, ARCHAIX veterans, and listen, they thrive on fact checking, pulling their calculators out, looking up sources, ordering the same books I talk about in my videos. We have a pretty interactive community, especially in other platforms off of YouTube where this research is continued. It's I just got the ball rolling, but there's a lot of people who have picked up the torch.
Yeah, you've definitely amassed a following. It's amazing. I started watching you. I think it was the interview with Santos Bonacci. I had done one with him, I think, about a year before. So I was familiar with Santos and his work on astrotheology and syncretism. And I was watching him before I ever got exposed to the flat Earth concept. So I kind of watched him railing against it and then digging into it, trying to debunk it, and then realizing, wow, this all makes a lot more sense. And then he went through his Alizatum phase. And so that was, there was a lot of really valuable information there. And I watched several interviews with you, like Alpha Vedic and Autodidactic as well. And then
I'll be going on with both of them pretty soon. Alpha Vedic and Campbell.
Yeah, but it was really I really enjoyed the ones you did with J Dreamers, because the two of you and the work that you've done, aside from Mud Fossil University, there's really no other channels that have really covered this stuff that relates directly to my findings. So, and I've been finding stuff, kind of stumbling upon it. I didn't go out looking for it. I wasn't trying to engage in research. In fact, I describe myself as a cross-disciplinary field researcher. You know, I'm not trying to corner the market on this subject, because I've got no background in geology. I've got no background in physics or chemistry or molecular chemistry. So a lot of this stuff, I'm just looking at, well, what did the history say? What did the mythology say? And, you know, when I was watching J Dreamer's Petrified Titans video, he was showing a lot of photographs of stuff that I considered even then to be pareidolia, of things that look like stuff. You know, there's millions of examples of photographs of rock formations that look like a face or look like a body, or, you know, that if you really ponder it, is it really? You know, I have not problems with what J Dreamers has done, but a lot of the people are pushing stuff as fact. This is what it is. This is what it appears to be, you know, and they don't have any background research into it. They're not actually doing any boots on the ground. They're looking at something where maybe the shadows are hitting at just the right angle, and so it looks a particular way, or the vegetation has grown in a way that accentuates, you know, what appears to be a face or what appears to be a body. So that was something that really frustrated me with the whole mud fossil community, both Roger and others, because Roger had his DNA analyses, which I think is great, because he's done the work to show that, hey, when I dug into these rocks and took them to a laboratory, it came back with humanoid DNA 3 different times with 3 different samples. That's big. That should be something that should be reported on worldwide, and should be, you know, the academia should be looking at this. But this gets back into narrative control, and it gets back into this idea that you know, these are narratives that would start to take down not just one ology, but multiple ologies, or would require major revisions of them. So to, you know, for them to allow this to come in, that means that a whole bunch of tenured professors are going to have to start admitting they were wrong about some major fundamental aspects about our reality when it comes to geology, petrogenesis, all these things. So I said to Roger a long time ago, because he and I have had a lot of contact over the years, because really there's nobody's work who's supported his more than mine. And yet Roger has been pretty silent about my channel from the get-go, even though we had a lot of, like, my first videos that I did on the Heartstones were called Mud Fossils, the Heart of the Matter, because I found a rock that was, to me, undeniably a heart. Now, I'm a chiropractor. I've studied a lot of anatomy.
Right.
And so when I found this in a river bottom and I started looking at it, I'm like, wow, that looks like a heart. And then I started looking closer and I started finding chambers. I found blood vessels. I found openings where the pulmonary arteries would have been. The aorta was there. There were all of these anatomic features that I recognized just initially on a first, couple minutes glance, and then brought it home and went into much greater depth with it. And I sent a video of that to Roger, and he took no interest. So that was when I made my first video about it. And that was when I still thought at that point that they were mud fossils, because that was the only reference I had was mud fossils. And he'd explained this process known as para-mineralization, which now I think he calls it nucleophilic substitution. But it's this exchange of elements. So when the mud flood happens, if there's a mud flood or if there's a volcanic ash, mixed with water, whatever it is that leads to one of these events, that's going to surround the body. And it's going to, depending on how much heat there is there, it's going to also destroy portions of the body. But then over time, that's going to lead to an infiltration of those minerals as the water and the gases work their way out. So that's even what the mainstream narrative is when we think about petrified wood. They call it para-mineralization. It's just that they tell us it takes millions of years or even hundreds of millions of years to happen. And he was saying, no, this can happen in a very short amount of time, given the right circumstances. And, he's absolutely right about that. But there's a whole lot of different kinds of circumstances that can lead to that, not just being encased in mud. It can happen through heat. It can happen through plasma. It can happen through high mineral content waters. These are things that I wanted to dig into with you to find out more about what you know about them. But I've got several threads going in different directions now. So, cross-disciplinary field researcher, this is the kind of thing that academia should be doing. But like you said, they've compartmentalized everyone. Everyone's an expert in their little tiny field. And they say being an expert is knowing more and more about less and less until you know absolutely everything about nothing. And so then they are experts and they have the letters after their name and they're confident about this little tiny thing that they know about. And then they don't have the ability to get a gestalt of the bigger picture and see where the overlaps are in totally unrelated fields, because nothing is unrelated, everything is connected. And so then they defer to the other experts and they say, well, that's not my area of expertise, so I'm not going to give you my opinion on that. I mean, just like we're seeing now with people who don't even know what a woman is. They're like, I don't know, I'm not qualified to tell you. It's like, oh, really? You didn't get pushed out of one? It's like,
well, having to rewrite the narratives is one of the if you've been paying attention, I've been shooting a lot of darts at those who still hold to the Ice Age theory, even though the science shows otherwise. The world that has been given to us is not one of ice ages, the Dryas and the younger Dryas. To me, these epochs never happened. Now, I understand they are beyond the scope of the ARCHAIX research, which goes back to 5239 BC, the historical record. But I can't help but reading out of all these old books, all these scientific reports that were putting out material showing we had a totally different world. I've been doing videos reading whole passages out of these books from the 1800s where scientists were at war against the minority of elitists who were pushing this Ice Age narrative. And they were showing that the data shows otherwise. This is not true. And I've been explaining to people where these ice packs and ice caps and this permafrost came from. It was formed instantly as soon as the vapor canopy collapsed. And this is why we have so many absolutely frozen life forms. But this collapse changed the pressure as well. Fossilization is absolutely instant. And I have 4 different videos showing probably over 100 different very unique fossils that are impossible by the standard scientific method, such as fossilized butterflies, fossilized jellyfish, fossilized dragonfly wings, the little cilia, microcilia on worms. I mean, all animals in the process of swallowing another animal, both animals frozen in time, stuck petrified in rock. I've
Right.
got fish giving birth, mammalian type fish giving birth to other fish where the baby is coming through the hip bones, fossilized in the birth process. I've got many pictures. I got pictures of animals fighting. I've got a fossilized spider. A fossilized spider about to pounce on a fly. I mean, it's amazing. This means for these clams and oysters, because this species only thrives at about 250 feet of saltwater depth or more. And yet we've got whole beds of these with the shells found, whole entire shell beds where all the clams and oysters, their shells were closed. This means they died instantly and were fossilized because the relaxation in death opens the shells. So, and the posture of a lot of these animals that have been found shows that they didn't die in the throes of death. There was no suffering and agony. It's almost as if this is a simulated construct, and in an instant it just shut down and rebooted. And everything that was here was flash frozen. And then it just introduced new programming, introduced new life forms, because it doesn't make sense to me how land-based life forms were flash frozen and petrified at the exact same time as creatures half a mile underwater. That means the whole construct was flash frozen, because to have hundreds of examples of fossilized jellyfish from all over the world means we're not dealing with a localized phenomenon. We're dealing with something that was systemic in here, and it killed everything at the same time. Even my neighbor, I'm in Texas, but we have a neighboring state nearby, Arizona. You go through Arizona, you got petrified national forest. You got thousands of petrified trees out there. Some of them have turned to agate and semi-precious crystals. There's fossils out there of giant turtles. There's all kinds of stuff out there. And it's real close to a meteor crater. It's real close to the meteor crater. It's called 1 Mile Crater in Arizona, which I don't believe is a bolide or an asteroid, a meteorite. I believe it was a caldera. It's something that exploded from underground and then collapsed. But maybe a water geyser, maybe just like the old texts say, during the Great Flood and collapse of the vapor canopy, it wasn't just water falling from the sky, but it was also water boiling up from the surface. But
yes, definitely. You're
does
familiar
call
with
for-
the.
Yeah,
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
that's why I introduced that, because I know that you know what I'm talking about. This hot boiling mineral water, and how it created many of the things that you're familiar with.
Right. Yeah. You've touched on so many things. Like, for example, the mammoths. You're familiar with the because this is an example to me of flash frozen, the mammoths, but they're still there's this is in the tundra of Siberia, from what I've read in mainstream publications, that there's actually meat that people are able to eat coming off of these mammoths because they've been so preserved for so long. So flash freezing, to me, I'm curious about the process by which flash freezing would lead to petrification. Do you know anything about that? Because the mineral waters, definitely, we can get to that in a second.
Okay, we're just gonna do a logic train real quick. If we have hundreds of samples that have been studied by thousands of people of jellyfish of different species and that are native to different depths of saltwater bodies, and we have these today, thousands of these petrified jellyfish, we know they weren't fossilized in water. So that means all the way down to the depth that they were at, the water itself froze solid in an instant. So then there's a thawing process. And we already know that salt water is mineral laden. There's minerals and there's all kinds of silicates and everything floating in this salt water. So over a period of centuries, or maybe maybe shorter, I don't know, due to temperature extremes, this thawing out is a process where you already know the surrounding silicates and minerals are absorbed into wherever the biology was. Wherever there is decay, it is replaced with the silicates and the mineral. And this deep freeze created the mold. And the mold fills with all these minerals and whatever compounds are there. Some of these fossilized jellyfish are absolutely perfect. They look like sculptures. So this is the only thing I can think of how it's possible that jellyfish, free floating with tendrils still like they're in the water, have been found so perfectly preserved. This is the only explanation I can think of. Even the ocean froze instantly. But as far as fossils on the surface, there's probably a couple different ways that they could have fossilized.
Yeah, well, the mainstream narrative tells us that such a thing is impossible,
Right.
or not. I mean, they'll come up with anomalous stories, but in general, it only happens in the rarest of circumstances. And that's why something like petrified organs is not, it's an extremely rare thing to find a petrified heart.
Right.
They would say.
Also, the establishment still claims, despite the evidence, that fossilization is the trait of the vertebrate. It's the vertebrates that fossilize. Invertebrates can't be found, and yet we still have all these jellyfish and earthworms and in leaves and silica, all these little cilias and all that. So
right, and the soft tissue of the vertebrate doesn't petrify, according to the mainstream model.
According to the mainstream narrative, but that's why I like to mention the jellyfish, because it throws all that shit out.
Exactly, and the reason they say that is because you've got all of these larvae, and you have different bacteria and things that are going to consume the flesh long before the millions of years that would be required for it to turn to stone. Right. So this is why Roger's theories initially made sense to me with regards to this, the mud flood. I was following a channel called Philip Druzhinin. He's a Russian guy. He's the guy who coined the term mud flood. And he's actually the first one who ever interviewed me. So shout out to Philip Druzhinin. He's done a lot of great research over the years.
I've never heard of him.
Yeah, he's done some great stuff. He's somebody you might enjoy interviewing. I've done probably 3 or 4 different interviews with him covering a lot of my research and different topics. But you mentioned the waters of the deep and this uprising of hot waters that are extremely mineral rich. And, we know they don't even have to be hot to create a mineralization and encasing of an object that will eventually harden all the way through. Mother Shipton's Cave is a perfect example of that, where people go and hang objects, and then the high mineral content waters drip down these objects, and then within a matter of months, they're fully encased. And, I don't know how long it would take for them to go solid. But the same thing with Lake Natron, for example. I can't remember what country it's in, but that's an example of another place where wildlife falls into this lake, dies instantly because the waters are so caustic. They're extremely hot, extremely base, and then they start to harden to the point where they look like they're already petrified in a short amount of time. So petrification through mineral water. Adding mineral water to ash is another way that it very likely happens, because you've got, when these events are happening, surely it's accompanied with massive amounts of volcanic activity, which are spewing huge amounts of volcanic ash up into the air. So that's going to come down eventually and mix with the mineral content waters. This is what another channel called Wise Up has shown a lot of information about over the years, and showing that
what you're saying here is very interesting, because I have multiple presentations where I'm explaining that in the historical record, the Phoenix phenomenon is always visited with high volcanism. A lot of ash and pumice and outgassing occurs, ambient radiation. Volcanoes are the reason we had a vapor canopy in the ancient world. It requires a lot of volcanism spewing up ash into the lower mesosphere. The mesosphere is very thick. It's a layer of the atmosphere that's miles thick, and it's water droplets. And when the lower mesosphere gets really thick with the volcanic ash, the real fine ash, and the Phoenix phenomenon is red dust, red mud, and red rain, depending upon the local humidity. When the upper mesosphere gets blanketed with this red particulates from whatever the Phoenix is, this is when we have this cloud covering that stays for centuries, and this vapor canopy. It basically solidifies, and it creates a dark midnight type world, and it traps basically the greenhouse gases. It increases the oxygen. Plants and animals grow larger. And vapor canopy I have three instances of the vapor canopy in the human historical record, but only one of them lasted like 15 centuries. The other two only lasted 24, 25 years, and both rapidly collapsed. But they're very well recorded.
Yeah, this ties in obviously to the work of Jay Dreamers, the whole plasma apocalypse thing. There was a guy before Jay Dreamers started talking about the plasma apocalypse, Brian Austin Lambert, I think was his name, and he was talking about the EMCO, which was the electromagnetic plasma changeover event, I think is what that stood for. He was a strange character who's no longer around, but he was talking about this major cataclysmic event. And so when I started, one of the first things I did after seeing a couple of your interviews was I went through your Phoenix playlist, and that was almost a year ago that I listened to those, and I planned on revisiting them for this conversation, but I didn't.
Yeah, if it's been a year, a year, I've got about 30 new Phoenix videos.
Yeah, but so that already then I was like, this is touching on the things that I'm finding, that are the results of these events, and. So, this, like I said, I've kind of worked backwards because I've been finding these empirical findings, understanding that, wow, maybe a lot of the stone that we're taught is forming over millions of years actually happened very quickly and was originally biological, but not as they're telling us. Actual, more directly biological than some, imaginary compression that led to all of these incredibly complex geological formations that we see, that don't make any sense when you start to think about sedimentary layering, tectonic activity, breakage, and erosion. We're seeing stuff that looks incredibly biological in geology, and I always thought so, but I was paradigm blind. This is a term I coined.
I like it.
I was blinded by the stuff that I was taught in school, and this mainstream geological paradigm about how rocks come about and how long that takes, and fossils only, they're only finding the skeletons because all of the other stuff gets eaten away, and then Roger comes along with this, para-mineralization concept for me that was big, because I realized, wow, if the body got encased in mud, that's an anaerobic environment. There's no oxygen there, right? So you're not going to have any, there are bacteria that thrive in an anaerobic environment, but for the most part, the larvae and the bacteria that would be eating away at the flesh, that long before it could petrify, those wouldn't be present in mud. So what Roger was saying made a lot of sense to me. But when I started finding petrified organs, it stopped making sense, because I was like, okay, well, where's the rest of the body then? And that was a total conundrum for me, because I found that initial heartstone that I sent him a video of, and he didn't use it. And then I started taking a step back and going, okay, is this just pareidolia? Have I found a rock that just happens to look like a heart, even though at that point it had 15 anatomic features that were very specific? And that was when I made the video. And then that's up to 23 or 24 now, because I got an endoscopic camera. I went inside, I started looking at it with microscopy. There were a whole bunch of things that I didn't notice initially that I started noticing later. So I said, well, if there's any truth to this, this can't just be a one-of-a-kind thing. There must be others like this. And so the second video I made on the subject, called Mud Fossils, The Heart of the Matter Part 2, I went out into the river bottom, you know, where you would expect to find these kinds of stones, because they've bounced around and eroded and smoothed out. That's where you find that kind of stone, right? Well, that's the official story. But I was finding these incredibly specific anatomical correlations over and over and over again. And the more I looked at it, and over the next couple of years, I started to refine my ability to spot these things, and started to notice patterns that I had never noticed before in the stones. And that's where I like to play backgammon, and you know, I understand what it's like to play games where, you know, cards where you're calculating odds. You know, what are the odds of finding a rock with 10 different anatomical features that match a heart? Well, every specific feature you add to that list, that number gets greater and greater, astronomically greater. Well, what are the odds of finding a whole bunch of them? But mud fossil theory didn't hold up after that. So I started just immediately pondering the idea that, well, the rest of the body must be getting destroyed in one way or another in the process of petrification. But I didn't understand how that would work. So I was working at it backwards. And it was Jay Dreamer's plasma apocalypse studies that you know, really kind of tuned me into, well, there must be something happening where the bones and the rest of the body are melting. And so I initially toyed with this idea of what I started calling boiled egg theory, because I figured, well, when you take an egg, it's liquid inside, it's got a shell that's thin, and that's kind of like the sac that surrounds the heart. It's called the pericardium. The heart has the thickest fatty layer surrounding, it's a protective layer of all of the other organs. It's got the thickest. And I just theorized that, you know, or hypothesized that you put an egg in the water, and within 6 to 10 to 12 minutes, you've got something that hardens and it's edible, right? Mm-hmm. And the longer you put it in there, the more it hardens. Mm-hmm. And you know, what would happen if you put that in with high heat into a pressure cooker for a longer period of time? You know, is it going to harden even more? You know, is it going to eventually turn to stone or something, you know, like stone? So that gets back to something you were touching on that I wanted to get back to. You were talking about pressure, because pressure obviously plays a big part in this process of petrification. Right. So I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Well, first of all, you finding a heart is not anomalous to me. I have pictures, and I have read many, many scientific reports of digits being found and being examined with cuticle, toenail, fingernails completely intact. Sometimes, like here in Texas, thumbs have been found not attached to a hand, but clearly identified as a thumb, but totally turned to stone.
Someone sent me one last week in email.
Yeah, a lot of people don't realize how often these are found and not recognized for what they are. But a lot of digits have been found of toes and of fingers. And I have examined these in books and the studies, and it just blows my mind that so many body parts and all that have been found. And it's I don't know. I'm gonna be the first to admit I'm a chronologist before I'm scientific at all. I am not really qualified to talk about a lot of scientific things, but I do realize that the vapor canopy world that is described like in Native American traditions and the times of Spider Grandmother, the dark midnight time, this period explains why some of our myths and traditions have these really weird references and anomalies, such as the Achaean and Greek traditions were real big on describing three types of people: the Titans, the giants, and just ordinary people-sized people. And there was a time period in Greek memory when all three coexisted at the same time, right after a reset. And it wasn't that people grew to huge sizes. The world that had collapsed, the world that they had come from, that was their normal size. And then after the reset and the collapse of that vapor canopy, after most of the oxygen had basically outgassed and is gone, there's the atmospheric pressure has plunged. The world changed. Now they're living under the burning disk by day, and it's not like it used to be when everything was thriving in a dark purple type light and growing and thriving like this. So this this land of the lost type world was gone. So the rainbow appears. We have this prismatic effect now, and the Sumerian and Egyptian pantheons at the exact same time had to make adjustments. And it shows that the Egyptian and the Sumerian cultures all must extend back into the vapor canopy period. They would have to, because the Sumerian pantheon was already well set when at the very end of Sumerian civilization, the sun appeared and they had to create a whole new god in the pantheon. They called him Utu Shamash. This is the sun god, which was unknown in all the earlier Sumerian traditions and older texts. The Egyptians did this at the same time. They introduced Horus, the son of the sun. At the same exact time, the sun calendars were born, and the very first sun was the water sun. This meant that the sun was born out of a sky that had been filled with water. This is the ancient Native American traditions. These are the ones that, like the Aztec stone of the fifth sun. The fifth sun is the apocalyptic period. It is the age that we are living in now that is soon to end. So this world would have been fundamentally different than what we know today. We are nowhere near the size that we used to be, and evidence of this is in archaeology. We can look at, check this out. We can look at the lowest portions of almost any old world civilization, and we will find two different types of architecture. The ancient Bronze Age architecture of cut and dressed blocks is what's been built over megalithic, heroic size, gigantic pieces of stone that we have no idea, like Baalbek and Ollantara in South America, at Tiwanaku, and there's so many different places. I could probably go through my books and name 40 different ancient sites. Even the lower walls of Jerusalem, Jericho, these massive blocks. We just don't know how the hell they would have moved that. And it wouldn't have been possible for people our size with our engineering. But in a previous world that had been reset and had been totally destroyed, those basement rocks and foundations remain the same. And later people came and built their own structures and cities on top of what they found. So this it's not anomalous to me that you found a heart or a petrified heart. There are many good books out there of things that have been found in the peat bogs, in the tar pits, in different swamps. Hell, I got one video that shows that 3 wooden ships were found petrified under 3 different mountains, one in North America, one in South America, and one in Switzerland right outside of Bern. But yeah, whole ships have been found underneath mountains and hollowed out caves. How the hell did they get there? What happened to the world that mountains were created around the ships and ships were found by coal miners? Can you imagine being a miner and just working the same veins for years? And this is your life. And this is how you support your family. And then 10 years into it, you hear rumors down from other work projects somewhere in the mountain that something unusual happened and a whole wall fell in and exposed a cavern. And now everybody's running to go check it out. You run into a cavern and see a whole fully intact wooden ship with strange symbols and about 40 men chained to the galley. The galley slaves who were rowing, they're all right there. It's crazy, but this has happened. But so yeah, these things are not mysterious to me. The real mystery is that we're talking about it, and the scientific community has totally ignored these things.
Yeah, my good friend Ben, he's got a new channel called The Archivist, Waking Up with Analog. and he's been archiving newspaper clippings from basically like the late 1800s to the early 1920s. And he's got a Twitter account. He's archived something like, there's already 8,000 clippings up on his Twitter account, and he's got another probably 10,000 to share. But he's been doing a series called Anomalous America, and he's been showing that there's basically 3 levels of architecture all over North America. And this was
Really?
openly reported on in newspapers all over the US until they were taken over and centralized.
Is he keeping his stuff? Is he backing it up in PDFs?
I'm sure he's got plenty of backups besides Twitter. Yeah.
Well, no. I don't mean no. Yeah. Backing anything up on just another social media site is just as bad. I'm talking about backing up on something like a thumb drive. Get it off the internet. It's
yeah.
Because it sounds like he's doing some important work.
Oh, he's doing amazing work. Yeah, and he's been finding clippings talking about everything that we've been discussing, every manner of petrified creature, wood petrified, all kinds of petrified forests of different sizes, and I highly recommend his channel. I want to go back to Titans though, because speaking of all manner of sizes, you've talked about Titans in numerous videos, and I just want to riff on Titans for a while. let me because just before you start, when I got into this and I started, looking at the mountain, it was after these videos of Rogers and Jay's. I didn't know anything about the Book of Enoch. I didn't know that the Bible was talking about the fallen angels and the men of renown and all these sorts of things. Actually, I think I heard a video of you the other day where you were talking about that being misinterpreted. But just this idea that these creatures were discussed not just in our mythologies, but in the religious texts. And we've got the myths of Paul Bunyan, and you've got the Norse mythology, and you've got the trolls and all these things. So it's like, just like the dragons are reported on in cultures all over the world, so are these titanic beings. And, the Book of Enoch even gives a measurement for them. And this was mind-blowing, because people in my comment threads, when I first started making videos, in the first few videos, they said, check out the Book of Enoch. And I had never even heard of it. And then they started, posting some of the passages from Enoch, where it actually gives a measurement, 3,000 ells, which is roughly a mile tall. And that lines up perfectly with the mountain that I had been doing the research on. Later on, just not so long ago, discovered the passage from the Bible, Ezekiel, which one? Ezekiel chapter 31, I think it is, where it's talking about the Assyrian, the great tree, and going into great detail about this tree that, its branches spread across the heavens, and it harbored all manners of different creatures, both in its trunk and in its branches. So there seems to be a plethora of evidence. Bless you. Plethora of evidence for Titans, but I'm just curious, what you can add to my knowledge base when it comes to Titans.
Well, in ARCHAIX, I never take an image as evidence of anything. It's one of my rules that, the internet is full of photography, it's full of images and all that. So I'm basically mathematically based, reference, source back. However, we have to take into consideration that the bristlecone pines, the Sequoia gigante, the redwood dawn pines, these gigantic redwoods in California, these huge trees. So because of their location, I suspect that the reason they are still free of termites and parasites, that they don't fall down, they don't die naturally, they're still there, they're ancient, they're in between 2,500 and 3,300 years old. They're right there in the only area in the world is where they're located. There are no other trees in the world that are like those trees. They're gigantic. Well, we got a highway going through one of them. I think it's General Sherman, where we cut all. So listen, these trees here, Is
It's not Sherman, but yeah,
you know what
you're
I'm
talking
talking
about the
about?
Sequoia National Forest. It's
Yes.
my home state, and I've camped in that forest several
So
times,
so
and
these
it's
trees,
phenomenal.
I don't believe these trees are an anomaly. I believe that they were the norm of the ancient world. And I believe the real anomaly is that trees are no longer growing that size, and they can't. But the reason they do there is because of its proximity to all the volcanic ambient radiation that is coming out of the ground. One of the largest calderas in the world is underneath Yellowstone, and that whole area of the North Midwest is basically on top of these giant lava caverns. And I believe that this this what we know of as volcanoes isn't anything that we've been taught to believe. Our world, I say this all the time, our world is not what you think. It's these organic compounds and materials have been detected in lava rock. They have been detected even in the days of Charles Fort. Scientists were baffled in 1902 when this red dust and red mud fell all over the world. It's the Phoenix year of 1902. This stuff was studied. In Rome, they actually published, the scientists, that they thought it was blood that was falling from the sky. They were looking at it under microscopes. Other scientists around the world had it tested, and it varied from continent to continent. This red dust in 1902 varied from about 17% organic to 85% organic compound falling falling out of the sky. And then Charles Fort in the Book of the Damned and in Low, he spends a lot of time going over all the scientific reports of carbonaceous material, almost like dead biology that flaked out of the sky and just fell in different areas like carpets and sheets of this stuff just falling in different areas of the world. And scientists would look at this. And at other times, this is where it gets really strange. I don't even talk about this on my own channel, but in Charles Fort's material, he spends some time explaining that what we see as shooting stars is something totally different, and that scientists have actually gone out to the sites where shooting stars were alleged to have fallen, and when they get out there, there's this clear goo, this clear jelly-like substance that's spread all over the plants and all over the ground, as if this was the substance, a liquid that was streaking as light going through the sky. And we think that it's hundreds of light years away, or we think or like comets, or we think that it's a meteorite that's friction burning through the atmosphere. But what Charles Fort shows is that this was a gelatinous material, and when scientists got close to it, the vapors made them sick. And this is so what I'm saying is these, to find biological materials in our strata would not be a surprise to me if biological materials are raining from the sky periodically, because this is where the evidence is starting to point. It's starting to point that comets aren't icy and rock and iron bodies that are going through a solar system. That's not how the tails act. The tails look like it's a body passing through liquid. Looks like, and many of the things, even the rockets that are released by NASA, when they go to a certain altitude, the ejecta no longer looks like smoke and fire. It looks like pressure being forced through liquid. So, there's a lot of people that have been making these associations that the higher you go in the sky, the closer you get to a layer of absolute just total water, or some other type of liquid. It may not be water, but these giants and titans, I have to be careful, because I've never seen a titan, although the historical record, they were there. They're acknowledged. Hesiod goes into detail about them. A lot of the old Greek writers do. And there was a difference between the Titans. The Titans were the original. And then later, when that world was gone, the Titans, when they had children, only gave rise to another generation, but they were the gigantes. They were giants, and none of them could grow as big as their parents, the Titans. They couldn't, because the world had fundamentally changed. Now, the giants themselves didn't last either, because the giants themselves, when they had children, they gave birth to normal-sized human beings. So this This is why we had, in one time in history, we had one generation that knew all of them. There was titans here, there was giants here, and there was normal sized people. And then the very first recorded war in the Bible, the very first time war is ever mentioned, is in Genesis chapter 14. And Keto Larimore of the East leads an expedition, and he is on a mission. And if you read the chapters, Genesis chapter 14 and 15, you will find that the very first time battles and war is mentioned in the Bible, it is a king with a confederacy of other kings, and all of them are of human size. And they go and they attack the Rephaim, the Anakim, the Zuzums, the Zamzumums, and the Emams. And then they're not satisfied with killing most of the giants and destroying their cities, because that's what they're called in Genesis. They go to the subcultures that were intermarrying with them, the Avams and the Horims and the Serum. They go attack them as well. The very first battles and war recorded in the Bible were regular humans taking out the races of the giants.
I heard an interview recently where you mentioned 100 titans. Is that something from texts that you?
I don't know what video you're referring to or what the context is.
Yeah, I just.
But there is a reference in Greek text to the gasteroicheres, which was the hundred-handed titans. But this was late. It was late in Greek history, and what was really being described were those big, long Phoenician ships that had 100 oars. But to the Greeks who had never seen vessels like that, the paddles looked like hands. So,
okay. So, yeah. I thought I might have misunderstood that, or I thought you were talking about like that they had been quantified. Like some talk about the fallen angels being, what was it, a number of 200 or something?
Oh yeah, I do have that in the video, because then the number in the Book of Enoch of the watchers who descended upon Mount Ardon was 200. It was 200. But yeah.
So if Montgo, because Enoch does give him a size, and if Montgo was a titan, then given the size of our realm, there aren't a lot of them out there, because nobody else has found one like I have, and gone through a forensic analysis and gone into the socket, the eye socket, and looked at the ear and done these kinds of analyses. So I thought maybe there'd be a lot more, but
hey, let me offer you something that we have to be careful on the data that we look at, because there are saboteurs online deliberately. Let me explain. A human skeleton I'm talking about epic proportion, was found in the empty quarter of Saudi Arabia. It is one of the most barren, empty deserts in the world. Nobody would have believed that they would have found architecture under the sand and evidence of civilization. But an oil company, or Aramco, did, and they found this gigantic human skeleton, and word leaked out to the public. So I would like to disbelieve it. I would like to be a critic and say, "Oh man, it's all Photoshop. It's all BS and all." I would like to disbelieve it, but I have to judge a phenomenon by its effect. And let me explain. The effect immediately was Aramco covered it up, and the Saudi military went out there and fenced the whole area off and no longer allowed archaeologists into the area. The online effect was equally disturbing. Just after the discovery, and it started circulating on in Facebook and online about this discovery, and pictures got out, almost instantly the internet exploded with obvious photoshopped skeletons of gigantic proportions that were so obvious that they're fake pictures. It's like an intelligence agency just flooded the truther community with a whole bunch of fake images, trying to muddle the waters and try to get everybody to believe that because these 10 pictures are obviously fake, therefore they're all obviously fake. This is
Yeah.
this is what
And now
happens
with AI, that can happen
Yeah, now with AI
just
art,
like that.
I'm really sticking to my guns.
Mm,
ARCHAIX will never use an image as evidence of anything. I just
mm,
can't. I like
yeah.
to I show images, but mainly I stick to my chronological charts and stuff like that. I just have to be safe. I have to be safe from cross contamination, especially cross contamination with an obvious lie or Photoshop materials and stuff. So the fact that you actually found a stone and you got 8 or 9 anatomical points that line up, that right there is fascinating.
It's
And
over
that right
20,
there has
but
all the
that's
meaning
just
in the
one
world.
of hundreds that
Yes.
I've found. And for every one I brought back, there were many, many, many more that stayed. But I've got limited space, so I just bring the ones that are the most beautiful. Now, some would say that's cherry picking, but I'm just showing that this is a very, very specific reoccurring pattern,
Right.
and it's realm wide, in my opinion. I've gotten people have sent me, photos and emails from all over the world, and a lot of them have found specimens that were more beautiful than what I found here. So yeah, it's a fascinating topic. There's no doubt about it. But
Yeah, man.
when I'm totally in agreement with you about AI and the effects that that's going to have on our reality when it comes to discerning truth and what is real and what is fiction. I've already been talking about that long before AI became popularized. I did a live stream on the subject of pareidolia because it ties in so much. Because that's obviously one of the criticisms that people levy against my work is that I'm suffering from pareidolia or apophenia, which is pattern recognition. They would say the same thing about you with the calendrics, I'm sure,
Mhm.
that you're recognizing a pattern that doesn't actually exist, even though I've heard a lot of people criticize your work and they never seem to go into the work at all.
No, they won't. They
Funny
won't.
how that is. They don't criticize. They always criticize the bearer of the information rather than the information itself. So um, yeah, and so I did this stream on the subject of pareidolia and truth or traps and the different things that especially when it comes to the whole mud flood titan community. There are so many photographs out there that are riddled with manipulation, and
Yep.
people are passing them off as if they're just fact, and they're not doing any photo forensics, and they're not like looking at what is the source of this image. They're not even doing basic checks like to look at the name of the location and then go and look at other photographs, and you find out, oh, this thing that looked like an elephant, is actually just a stone that somebody that put in Photoshop and made to look like an elephant. So that's a frustration because it just muddies the water when there's people out there trying to do some proper research, and it needs to be boots on the ground. And you need a photograph is one thing. If you've got a whole bunch of photographs and it's combined with video and it's on site and it's live, that's a hell of a lot harder to manipulate than one angle of a particular mountain that's shown over and over again, and someone adds some eyes and adds an ear, and next thing, there's all kinds of different variants of these photographs. So it's really I've tried to distance myself from it. A lot of people send me photographs, and I'm just like, I'm not going to pass any judgment on it. There's a whole load of people that are looking at Google Earth, and they're just looking from above, and they're doing pattern recognition, which is great. But it's like a Rorschach test. I'm really
Yeah.
great at that. I've got abstract art, behind me that I can look at it and I can see all kinds of faces and different things.
Right.
That's a very real phenomenon that people have to acknowledge. And when you're just looking in one dimension, in 2 dimensions, looking at something flat from above, that you'll see something, you'll be like, that's a body, there's the elbow, well, you turn that thing upside down, you'll see a different creature, you'll see a different, it's like it's going to change depending on the angle you look at it from. And so that was the thing with Mont Go initially, that first day, where I'm just like, I saw Jay Dreamer's video and I'm like, there's just no way. I mean, that couldn't be, And so the first thing I did was I got on Google Earth, because I knew you could get in and you could tilt it 3D and you could zoom around things and look at it from all kinds of different angles. And I'm like, damn, that looks like a head from above, from the side, from the front, Not completely from the front, because the left side of the head is crushed, and even in mainstream geology, they did a massive geological survey on this mountain, and they call that portion of the mountain right there where it kind of curves down, they call it a synclinal, and even in mainstream geology say that's where there was a major collapse. So that's where the left eye and the left ear would have been, right where that collapse is. Now, some people might say, oh, that's really convenient, but I kept looking further, and you had cutouts right where the neck would be. I talked about the discoloration. It's a quarter moon discoloration exactly where the ear would be. And there's a cave right in the center of that shape. And just happened to be the most thoroughly excavated cave in all of Europe at the time that I was looking into this. I didn't even know it existed. I started with the eye, and I thought, okay, I'm not going to fall for the whole pareidolia trap, and I'm not going to just start claiming, hey, there's a giant elephant mountain in Spain that used to really be an elephant. You know, that's kind of batshit crazy, you know, even by flat earthers standards. I mean, some of my biggest critics are flat earthers, which is rich. You know, this is coming from a community of people that, you know, basically are believing the opposite of almost every narrative you've got, you know, and they're like, no, we're not going anywhere near that, you know, which I understand. So my approach to it with the eye was similar to what I did with the Heartstone, which is, well, we know the anatomy of the eye. We know the construct of an eye socket. The morphology of skulls changes dramatically from species to species, but essentially the makeup of the bones is similar. So the shapes change, but you know, something like an eye socket is going to be very similar across species. And there are these points where the bones meet in lines. Those are called sutures. And then you've got spaces between some of those lines, which are fissures, where like the optic nerve would go. And then you get attachment points for the muscles that move the eyes. And there are all of these very, very, very specific anatomical features that an eye would have if it was really an eye, even if it was a giant petrified eye. And so I decided, all right, after looking on Google Earth and finding that first 2 hours that I was looking at the mountain, I found 10 anatomical correlations. That's already a big number. And that was without visiting the eye. And I had been up to the eye in the past several times just hiking, because I've hiked all over this mountain. And I never, you know, I never understood how that cave could have formed. Way up there, tectonic activity, pushing this stuff upward, and then this perfectly formed, curved, unbroken cave with all of these weird things going on inside of it. How the hell does that happen? You know, I puzzled over it, but it wasn't something like I stayed up nights thinking about, and you know, until these topics came into my life. But so I decided to approach it backwards, and I got out the anatomy books first, and I really, really poured over elephant anatomy. I found an online video of an actual elephant skull that people were panning around, so I could see it from lots of different angles. I knew where the fissures should be. I knew where the sutures should be. I knew where there's right here on humans, we have a thing called the infraorbital foramen, which is a place where blood vessels and a nerve come out. Well, on elephants, it's here. And the elephant mountain, the head is tilted back like this. So that would take this hole that's here, and it would place it like in front of the eye. And I saw that on Google Earth before I even went up there, and I'm like, holy shit, that's the infraorbital foramen. And then I looked on the elephant skull, and it was exactly there. And that's a cave with a channel going through it. In my 5th video of the Unveiling a Titan series, there's 6 videos. The first one is just an overview. Second one is about the eye. Third one is about the ear. Fourth one is about the tissues, the histology of the mountain, where I go into the stones, what makes up the stones, all kinds of things that I found when I started looking forensically at the mountain, with microscopy and, looking at what would you expect to find if this really was Titan bone? How does that compare to bone, our size bones? Like what are bones made of? You know, that's what the fourth video is all about. Anyway, the fifth video, the thumbnail of that video is looking through this infraorbital foramen that is a cave that's, you've got the eye socket and then this cave protruding. So without even going up to the cave, there was already like a dozen anatomical correlations that perfectly lined up. And then once I got to the cave, that's, you know, that was that the second and the fifth videos are about the eye. There's another dozen or more correlations inside the eye socket. So that's the kind of thing you would want people to be doing in the titanology community, if there were such a thing, instead of just like posting picture after picture after picture going, look, it's a giant, it's a Titan's head. This mountain is, you know, a Titan. And another thing about it is we have all of these different tissues, cartilage, bone, fat, you know, the cornea, they're all different molecular constitutions. You know, they're all different elements. So some might get destroyed in the petrification process, depending on what they are, and others are going to be preserved. Well, that means that we should have a variety of different kinds of materials. It shouldn't just all be the same stone. It doesn't make any sense, you know. So that's how I approached it, and here I am, you know, years later, talking about this stuff with you. But
well, let me address two things. This first, it is the different compositions that actually would do away with a criticism that I will offer now, because I'm trying to wrap my mind around these gigantic sized biological life forms, and the only way I can do it is that it's a vapor canopy that pre-exists the human historical record. It can only be that way because in the historical record we just don't have any references to anything that big. So I am very aware that the Magdalenian Cro-Magnon were very sophisticated in their aesthetics, in their art. The cave art isn't just on par with the greatest artists today. It's like a Rembrandt going in, just painting these steers and ibex and elk and moose and cave bears. These people painted these things. But Mike, these people used the actual outcrops of the stone itself to give their paintings a three-dimensional contour. And it's beautiful. A lot of people don't know that about Cro-Magnon art. Cro-Magnon art, they use the cave features to do the shoulder of the buffalo. And
Graham Hancock's talked about this in his books.
Yes, it's
in his book Supernatural, he mentioned that.
Yeah, he's a Graham Hancock. Hey, you know what? He's got a lot of good material, and I've given him his props many times. I'm just a huge critic of his Atlantis chronology, and I think he needs to quit talking about it because he's absolutely wrong, and the right information is out there, but it doesn't detract from a lot of his other material, which is pretty good. So anyway, so let's take this to another level. Imagine a time period when all humans are titanic by our standards. Imagine a time period, let's say way before the ARCHAIX model begins, let's say 30,000 years ago. All right. We're not dealing with ice ages. I don't see any evidence of it. We're dealing with another vapor canopy world where people are much larger. We may be made of some other biology, not as dense as we are today, something else. Now, get this. My criticism, until you mentioned the different compounds that make up these deals, would have been, could it not be possible that this is an ancient type of feng shui that you're describing, that giant civilizations actually made sculptures out of mountains in the same way that the Chinese sculpt the land? They sculpt everything. Even natural rock formations are turned into boars with tusks. The Chinese are very artistic like that, and they use all the natural energies in their environment, and they create these landscapes that what about a civilization that was so aesthetic in the past that they did that? Now, that would have been my criticism, but you are making a very good point that under the microscope, biological materials can be seen fossilized, and that different. So I get that. I get that, and it would do away with that argument 100%. So I want to interject one more thing, because you went off on a long deal, and I wasn't able to get this in, but you asked about giants. I have a video about the lost cities of Bashan, because the Western world doesn't really know this, but there was an archaeologist named Porter in the 1870s, and he wanted to see if the wars of the giants was a historical occurrence. Did this really happen? Did Chedorlaomer of Elam and Amraphel of Babel and Tudel of the Hittites come together and fight a war against giant nations? And if they did, he'd find evidence of it in Syria, because in the Genesis narrative, it is in Syria where we find these giant civilizations. However, later on in the Torah, I believe it's in the book of Numbers, it's specifically mentioned that the cities of Bashan were built by the Rephaim giants. And Porter had already excavated unusual architecture around the world. So he goes into the mountains of Syria in this real rural area and finds perfectly intact. He wrote a whole book. And it's my video. I quote whole sections out the book, but he wrote an entire book about his finds. He found cities in the mountains of Syria that it's almost like untouched. Nobody even comes out here anymore. And they were the only, oh my God, what just happened? I had a blackout. I had a blackout for a second. So
you're still here.
So anyway, the only type of people that could have inhabited these, because of the staircases, the sides of the beds, the sides of the doors, and the portals, these people had to have been on average 9 foot, 9.5 feet tall. And this is precisely what we're told Goliath's height was. And he is described as the last of the descendants of the giants. Goliath that was killed by David in the Old Testament. But Bashan, the cities of Bashan are still there today, and they made their doors by an unknown process. They had to have known how to forge and soften rock. And the reason Porter believes this is because the megalithic doors and the door jambs and lintels were all made of one stone, but they could move. And it's impossible. We can't do that today without manufacturing that. But it was all made of one stone. And you can't make door jambs and lintels and the actual slab of the door itself out of one stone. It's impossible. They had to have had some type of technology where they could fuse stone together and make it appear to be one stone. But anyway, it's
I'd like to interject just another possibility,
Sure.
which is that originally the stones were wood that was petrified. Because
That's a good point.
when looking at the the evidence for megafauna, of a titanic size, obviously, there's my work, but in the mind of the mainstream, that's anything but conclusive. It's just a crazy idea. And it's not like there's a whole bunch of other researchers that have come after me with, additional evidence that supports the idea. And Roger's, dragons, which are this, continental size creatures that could very well be pareidolia. There's a lot of detail there that's fascinating to ponder. And I think it's fun, to give that consideration. And there are lots of other dragons, that can be seen on Google Earth, dragon, plume, serpent kinds of things, and other shapes. But I've already talked about how easy it is to, just see a pattern and assume that it's something. But for me, the most compelling evidence of all for the vapor canopy world, for Titans, for the idea that our mythologies, whether it's the Norse mythologies or the Hopi, these ancient cultures that discuss this time of the Titans and these great creatures and plant life, they're talking about the trees. You know, this is what Hollywood gives us in the form of Avatar movies, you
Yeah.
know. But you know, there's a channel called Hangman 1128. He's been around for as long as I have, or even longer. You know, 5 or 6 years. He's been looking into this in the Colorado region and the Dakotas, Arizona. He's been all over, boots on the ground. He's got hundreds of hours of footage that is the most compelling that I've ever seen. Now, everyone's talking about the tree stumps, and there's this whole no forest on flat earth thing that came out like 6 years ago, 7 years ago, took the interwebs by storm, looking at the Devil's Tower and these different plateaus, these different mesas around the world, and the tipues or tipuis, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, these you know, these plateaus that jut upward, and they've got waterfalls coming out of the top, even though there's, you know, where's the water coming from? It's fascinating, and I never really addressed it at all because to me it wasn't conclusive, and there were lots of different theories. Like Roger thinks Devil's Tower was an Achilles tendon of a titanic creature that's, you know, the heel is buried underneath and the tendon is all we're seeing. I don't particularly agree with that. I think it's far more likely that it was a stump, or, you know, there's a video that I put on my channel showing like 20 different kinds of mushroom that grow in this exact same fashion. So if you've got trees that are 6, 8, 10 miles in diameter, which is what the work of Hangman 1128 is showing in my mind unequivocally, it is self-evident that this is the case. When you look at his footage and you see that it is identical in every way, shape, and form to petrified trees of a smaller stature, and then we know that we've got the sequoias, which we already talked about, which are like an intermediary size. Those would have been saplings, you know, little sprouts next to these great trees. So if you take a petrified piece of tree that's this big, and you compare that to a tree that would have had a 6, 8 mile diameter, now you're talking about something that's 50 to 100 feet wide. And that's exactly what he's showing. And he's showing all of the detail, all of the grain of the wood, all of the different phases of decomposition. Because in the Bible, they talk about, you know, that that they went to work at the great trees, right? Or was it the Book of Enoch, where the idea was that the flood was going to come, and so the trees were removed to prevent the you know, the ones who the flood was supposed to destroy from having an escape, you know, from being able to climb up the trees to escape from the floods. I have no idea if there's any truth to that narrative, but it's the idea that these trees were felled and then, you know, or destroyed through some kind of cataclysm. They laid for a long time decomposing, and then the great floods came, and that's what led to the petrification, because it was combined with volcanic activity. And I've hypothesized for a few years now that not all, but many of the volcanoes in the world could very well have been ancient trees, because what you see when these trees petrify is that they give rise to all of the different materials that we find in the periodic table. You know, Ben from the archivist, who I talked about earlier, he's shown loads and loads of articles of petrified forests where they're harvesting trees that had 40% copper, 60% silver, huge amounts of gold. They're finding all of the different elements in these trees. Now, were the trees growing those elements, or was there some kind of a transmutation of the biological material that was in the tree in the process of petrification? And I would say 100% yes, that's exactly what happened. Because what we're talking about is, on one hand, you've got the high mineral content water narrative mixing with volcanic ash. That all can explain a whole lot of different kinds of petrification. But you mentioned it before, the volcanic activity and the ash, when that spews up into the sky, you're going to get plasma in huge quantities. And this ties into, you know, Jay Dreamer's plasma apocalypse and the EMCO event. In both of my last live streams, I was showing how trees produce opal. I was showing how that in scientific experiments where in a microwave, a guy shows you right there taking two different powders of different constitutions. He mixes them together. He puts it in a thick glass votive, like you would put a little candle into, that's not going to break as the plasma hits it, because you've got a magnetron in a microwave. They're very powerful. He puts this in with a ceramic lid, so there's a little bit of vibration, and it allows the plasma to move in and out. And the plasma heats this stuff up, these powders, and those two powders combined, within 10 seconds, he's making pretty damn good sized rubies. Rubies, which are number 2, or not number 2, they're number 9 on the hardness scale after diamond, which is 10. So right there, you've got an experiment showing that plasma can turn a powder into, it turns it to, molten vitrified ruby in seconds. So if you've got volcanic activity happening all over the world, and it's combined with something happening outside of the dome, if there is a dome, or outside of the electromagnetic field, if there is one, that's then interacting with all that ash, you have every element you need for instant petrification of any number of different things. So I think that's what happened with the great trees. And Hangman 1128's footage, in my mind, is undeniable. It's self-evident, and people are nitpicking, like, it's kind of like what they do with flat earth. It's like, show me the model, show me the steps molecularly. How does the chemistry work? And it's like, I don't know. And if you do a chemical analysis of that using spectroscopy, it's going to be different elements than the tree, because clearly this is stone, it's not wood. So if the petrification happened, there's going to be a transmutation of elements. So it's not going to be the same anyway. So I don't have the skill and the wherewithal to be able to prove that. I also don't have a spectroscopy machine, but this is the kind of science that needs to be done. And then they're going to be able, so this gets back to what I was saying before, my theory that I think a lot of the volcanoes are actually trees that contain whatever the initial constitution of elements was to give us uranium, plutonium, radium, right? These are the most volatile radioactive elements that are known, and they use them for supposed nuclear power. And radium is a huge subject. I don't know how deep you've gone into radium. That's really fascinating. That's another thing that both Ben, the archivist, and Old World Florida have talked about quite a bit. But we've got radium springs. We've got all of this stuff that looks to the possibility that, say, one of these massive trees got hit with a plasma bolt, or whatever you would call it, the likes of which we can't even imagine. What's it going to do to those elements? Are they going to just deep down in the earth be festering and molten, and eventually burble up, and percolate to the surface in what we call today a volcanic eruption? Well, right. There's a lot of evidence that I've shown in my videos. Wood turns to coal, turns to obsidian, right? If you look inside the volcanic calderas, you can see all this layering of it looks a hell of a lot like tree rings. And then my last video was called Spelunking Titanic Trees, and showing these guys rappelling down 500 feet, and then another rope. They go through these channels. They're supposedly carved, I guess, by water, but they're not smooth whatsoever. So how did they get there? Why is it shaped like that? I address all of that in those videos.
Wow. Hey, check it out, Mike. Do you see the comment on the screen?
The world is a corpse. I've seen this before, and
future fields forever. Thank you for the comment. I haven't verified it. It says Book of Thomas says the world is a corpse. Now, this is a Gnostic gospel, the Book of Thomas, but for it to say that the world is a corpse is no different than the Viking Norse traditions that the world was created out of basically the cadaver of Ymir, the frost giant. The frost giant was killed, gutted, opened up, and the gods basically built our world from a dead body of a titan. So I'm just saying it's an interesting comment because it does have some crossover. The Norse are not the only ones to believe that our world was constructed from a biological life form of a pre-existing creature.
My friend
Remember,
13th
hold
monkey.
on. Remember the Babylonian traditions. This world is the construct that was built out of the body of Tiamat, the dragon.
Yeah. So again, once again, mythology. I mean, my take now, I've seen so much evidence of lies and rewriting of history, and I mean, what is this reality, and what is our true history? To me, I have a lot more faith in the ancient religious texts and mythology than I do over any modern narratives when it comes to anything about our realm and our true history as beings. And my friend 13th Monkey, he's star fort mapper extraordinaire. He's mapped over 10,000 star forts worldwide in his KMZ file. He knows the realm like no one else from a Google Earth perspective. Amazing work that he's done, put in thousands of hours of work. He believes that we live inside of a Titan skull. So he may turn out to be right. I'm not sure how you'd verify that, but yeah, it's fascinating. Going back to the plasma thing with the big trees, if you think about these things reaching up into the sky, our modern rainforests, which that's where the majority of the wildlife in the world exists, right? And the great biodiversity. They say that 80% of that wildlife lives in the tree or on the tree, right? So it's either in the trunks or on the trunks. So if you scale that up to avatar size, how much wildlife could have existed? Dante in the 13th century, if the chronology is right, he wrote about flocks of birds that were so many birds that they would block out the sun for hours at a time as they were flying by. Well, that makes a lot more sense in a vapor canopy kind of a world, right, where, how much wildlife, how many beings could those tree canopies have supported? Well, what's going to happen when the plasma apocalypse hits, right? This gets back to my boiled egg theory. Which areas are going to get hit first? The ones that are tallest, right? Mm-hmm. So all of that wildlife in the trees, this might get back to your raining body parts, comment at the beginning of the conversation. That's the wildlife that's going to go first. So I think this is where a lot of our pebble beaches, some of it may be eroded fragments of larger structure, which is the official narrative, the water erosion and the elements just taking their toll on what was originally a fragmented piece of something larger. But I think that a lot, I've come to the conclusion now because of my studies with the petrified organs, that a lot of the smooth stone that we call river rock are varying things like kidney stones, lymph nodes, organs, gallstones. These things exist in huge numbers in bodies of all scales. So if they're already stone, and an event hits that just decimates the body, well, the stones are going to survive the decimation, and they're going to rain down to the earth, and then they're going to accumulate through wave and different kinds of motion. And it's like all of it starts to really dovetail and make more and more sense when you start to look at the bigger picture with all of these different theories. It's not like a harebrained idea where you're trying to bend over backwards with your thinking, right, to make your stupid theory make sense. It's actually the opposite. Like there's so many things that have come my way since I started on this that I never knew anything about, that I didn't go looking for because I was trying to prove my ideas. And all of a sudden, there's whoa, I didn't know about that. I didn't know about bog bodies until a few months ago. You know about those bog bodies?
Bog bodies? Are you talking
bog
about
bodies?
You're talking about the peat bogs, the humans,
exactly.
The humans that they were found in the peat bogs.
Yep, I didn't know anything about them. So I was theorizing a plasma apocalypse. This is the nature of the boiled egg theory, right? The outer portion of the body is being destroyed through heat or fire or electroplasma activity. And as that's happening, the inner side, you've got your organs are in a protective fatty sac. Those are in your chest and abdominal cavities, which are in another big protective sac that's liquid filled. So there's your pressure cooker, right? And then as the outer portions of the body are being destroyed, just like a hard-boiled egg, the egg is gonna harden, right? And I theorized that was what was happening. But I couldn't figure out like where are the bones. You would expect the bones are already hard. You would expect them to survive the process.
Right.
Well, a friend, I'm a vegetarian, so I never made bone broth in my life. And a friend of mine one day, Armuro, shout out to him, he was like, have you ever made bone broth? And I was like, no. He's like, if you take a thick bone and you put it into a pressure cooker and you cook that thing, you know, at a relatively low heat compared to like a pyroclastic flow or a plasma apocalypse,
turns into a sponge.
It turns to sponge, and then it turns to a gelatin. It liquefies. And that's not even with extreme heats. That's in a friggin' crock pot, right? Wow. So I was like, well, that makes perfect sense then. The organs are hardening, the bones are dissolving, and, you know, and then eventually the outer skin and whatever, or that's just getting destroyed from the beginning. And I knew nothing about bog bodies. Bog bodies are in peat, like you said, which is highly acidic. And I just learned that the acid causes the bones to deteriorate and the organs to harden. So what you end up with is a skin bag with hardened organs and no bones. Well, eventually that skin bag is gonna erode, deteriorate,
right?
And the hardened organs might be surrounded in mud, might be surrounded in, you know, some high mineral content water, and then your para-mineralization is going to finish off the process. So there is literally an infinite number of variations about how this stuff could come about. You know, as far as, you know, one kind of petrification is going to lead to one thing, another kind is going to lead to another thing, then you've got varying stages of decay, and then the petrification can come as the decay is happening. You alluded to the mold earlier, right? Mm-hmm. Something could have mold that's infused into it. I mean, now geology is starting to make a hell of a lot more sense, because when you look at the mineral kingdom and the agates and all the different manifestations of these kinds of materials, it's like the petrogenesis, you know, sedimentary, metamorphic, and, you know, igneous, which is your, you know, volcanic rock. It just falls short in explaining these things, especially when you see Hangman's footage of the trees, because that is, I'm more convinced about his findings than I am about my own, and that's saying a lot. I'd be more convinced of my own if someone else was coming along and doing something similar to what I've done with the mountain, you know, or found heartstones with even more detail.
That's it. That is interesting. It's yeah, I'm, like I said, it's far beyond the scope of my research. However, my research does involve a vapor canopy scenario. It just doesn't seem to be near as accentuated as what we're describing. But there is provision, like I just said, in many of the oldest traditions about how this world was made. And from a primitive post-reset society, that's basically how they would describe it. I mean, even the oldest belief about our world is an entity, Gaia. That's the whole concept of Gaia. Gaia was a living, breathing entity, and we're living on it. But so yeah, I don't know, man. It's really interesting because the peat bogs fascinate me, because what I've read is that brain tissue from Cro-Magnon have been perfectly preserved in the peat bogs, and it's almost as like the brain itself was housed in a mineral sac. And what you're describing, that mineral sac, is the old cranium. The cranium had been liquefied. So this,
but not just the cranium. You've got the dura pia and the I should know this really quick. It's basically the oh, my brain just stopped working with this. I'm a chiropractor. I should know this like instantly. It's the fatty tissue that surrounds and protects the brain. You know, you've got your whole central nervous system, and you have the cerebral spinal fluid that circulates up through the spine and into the brain. It has this complex pathway that it takes through the brain and through the ventricles of the brain. But then all of that is encased in a fatty material. So in a peat bog, the bone is gonna decay, right? But the fat is going to protect the brain itself, which is almost entirely fat.
Yeah, that's I can't remember. I wish I could remember maybe it was Kingdom. What was that? Kingdom of the Neanderthal. Andrew Collins or somebody. I can't remember who wrote it, but yeah, there's a really good book that goes into the peat bogs and goes the human specimens that have found, whole organs have been found absolutely intact. It's amazing. It's amazing. But it's the same thing with the La Brea tar pits. It's they like to say the La Brea tar pits they date back to the Ice Age 10,000 years because they've got saber-toothed tigers and megafauna, three-toed sloth. But I don't believe that at all. I don't believe those tar pits are near as old as they say. But I would really like them to dredge them, but they won't. But I want them to dredge them so they can find human skeletons mixed in there with all their megafauna. And yeah, I don't. You know what?
They probably find too many giant humanoids, you know, that would destroy narratives. I mean, there's so much evidence for giants. Yeah, I mean, but they always get squirreled away by the Smithsonian and get disappeared. You know, going back to the whole petrification thing. Also, you know, there's an 18th century Italian scientist named Girolamo Segato, and he had a contemporary named Paolo Gorini, and both of those guys knew how to petrify flesh of all types. And there's actually a museum, I think more than one, that's dedicated to Girolamo's work, and you can find all kinds of images online. I've got, in the very first video I ever made, I made mention of this. So there's so many examples of soft tissue petrifying, and that it can be, you know, brought about in a very short amount of time, so that, you know, when they dismiss this stuff with hand wave dismissals like, oh, there's no evidence to support that, they're either ignorant or they're just flat out lying.
Well, the double standard is that those of us in the community who are bringing to the table original research and original findings were held to a much higher standard than the scientific community holds itself. It's a double standard. And what I mean is to be a scientist today doesn't mean you did the work. All it means is you accept what you were told that other men found. That's not true science to me. That's just education. But you get to call yourself a scientist because you paid for the education, you went through the channels, and you got your doctorate, you got your master's, you got your PhD. You're peer reviewed. But all you've really done is just accept what other books and materials have told you prior men concluded, and this is the basis for your beliefs. So scientists to me are only religionists. Their religion is disguised as something else, but they're exercising faith, not intellect.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah,
Mike, we're gonna have to conclude. That's about 2 hours right there, and sure. I do have another show to do. But listen, I should have brought you on my channel a long time ago, or I should have came on yours, because we got to do a part 2. Because in the process,
it'd be fun to show people, you know, because it's one thing to describe it with words, it's another thing to see it, and to see it compared with the anatomy and compared with the, you know, the histology, the tissues themselves. There's so much to it, and there's a whole bunch of bullet points that I had related to things like synchronicity and the matrix and simulation and all these, and, you know, different ideas about those things, because synchronicity has been a huge part of my research since the beginning. There's just so many things that have just fallen in my lap in ways that are unbelievable. I did a whole stream called the Synchronicity Stream, that if people are curious about that topic, watch that video, because I tell stories in there of things that happen that will absolutely blow their minds.
Well, can we do
And
a presentation? Let's pre-record a presentation where you can actually show the imagery. You know, this is a
yeah.
live video, and I don't have the technical expertise to figure out how to do that on StreamYard yet. Maybe Martin will teach me. But
Yeah, given a little bit of notice, I can do it live as well.
okay, all
We don't
right.
have
Well,
to. We can pre-record or do it live, whichever.
yeah, let's do one of those. But for now, I've got Mike STELLIUM7. I got his channel in the description box. It's the first link you'll see. Easy to get to his channel. I did notice that many of you in the comment section have already said you subscribe to him, and that's good. I appreciate it. I'm gonna go check some of these videos out in my leisure time because, like I said, I'm on board with another vapor canopy. It just has to be further back in the distant past, beyond the scope of the human historical record. So
I think the best evidence for the vapor canopy, beyond like the chronology that you've been presenting and the overlaps, historically, is the footage that Hangman has shown. Hangman 1128 is his channel.
okay, yeah, shout him out. I don't know who he is. If maybe one of my moderators can put his link right here in the comments before this video goes off, so it'll be preserved in the chat.
It's easy to find. And yeah, there was one last thing I was going to say. Oh, for people who just don't have a lot of time and want to see a quick kind of rundown of the things that I was talking about, I did a 2-part series called Petrified Titans and Organs, the discoveries, and Petrified Titans and Organs, the how and why. The major thrust of my channel has been Titans, petrified organs, and petrification in general, and more recently the big trees, because I really have felt that that's something that needs to be championed, because it's some of the most compelling evidence out there for the need to completely rewrite our historical narrative. Yeah, and then there's all kinds of other little side topics that I cover, but that's the main thrust of the channel. So thank you for inviting me on. It's fun to be here. I've been listening to you for a long time and heard a lot of interviews and covered a lot of your content. And so it was fun to actually talk to you.
Well, this was good. It was I didn't know what direction we were going to go in, because I know that we have a very different slant on history, but history is a big place, and we're talking about 2 different time periods, but we're also talking about a common denominator, which is the vapor canopy, in which I already admit in my presentations we've had a few times in Earth history we've had vapor canopies. So yeah, all that's good, guys. I want to remind you of the meetup on the 10th. Martin Leakey and I are going to be there giving a very special presentation on one of the 7 wonders of the world. It's not the Great Pyramid, but it's something that you have been told, and it's deliberate misinformation because they're covering up what this object truly is. Martin and I are doing a dual presentation. We're both sharing at the same time. It will be broadcast live on YouTube, so you can see it. For those who want to go to the meetup, it's in like North Houston, Spring Branch. We are taking cash at the door. You don't have to go on the meetup site. Also, we have a special guest or two. And one of those special guests is Max Egan himself.
Cool.
The 3 of us will be there. And like I said, don't be surprised by whoever else you see. But we're going to have some things provided. We got a few ARCHAIX t-shirts and mugs and stuff like that. But one thing that Martin and I have done, and we're not really sure what we're going to do with it yet, but this is a 68 gigabyte drive, and it takes 2 hours and 20 minutes. But it has 7,147 old books, all in English, on this drive. And it's Martin's whole collection, and it's my whole collection.
I want one of those.
This is an entire library. Just to give you some proper perspective. Remember, guys, in prison, I was researching for a long time, but it still took me 20 years to read 1,300 nonfiction reference books. And anybody can see the list. It's free on Podia as a download. So it's in my links. You can download the whole 1,300 books that I read and studied before I was ever released from prison. I've read more since then, but this is 7,147 books. And it has thousands of old images, because these old books were all packed with pictures, illustrations and photos. So anyway, Martin and I are still trying to decide what we're going to do with that. We've already made about 20 of them, but it literally took us a day and a half to make those 20. It takes a long time for those to copy. So this is Mike, STELLIUM7. His link is in the description box. And guys, you got to break free or die trying.
Peace.